When we're working with REST APIs, the response is just as important as the request. Every API call returns a status code and often a payload. And for the Encore exam, you're expected to be able to interpret what those responses mean when working with a platform like Cisco Catalyst Center or REST-Conf-enabled devices. And a REST API response has two main parts. First is the HTTP response code. That's going to tell us whether the request succeeded or failed. Then we have the payload. Typically, this payload is formatted in JSON and it contains the actual data that's being returned by the API. That might include device information, configuration details, maybe an error message. And here are some response codes that I'd like you to be able to recognize for the Encore exam. Now, this is not a comprehensive listing, but these are the big ones I want you to commit to memory. 200 OK. That means the request succeeded. A 201 created, that confirms that a new resource was successfully created. And we actually saw this earlier. You might remember when we used Postman in our REST-Conf demo, we sent instructions to our CSR1000V to create a loopback interface. And the response we got back and we saw displayed in Postman was 201 created, letting us know that the loopback interface had been successfully created. A 400 response code, that means that our request was not in a valid format or it didn't have a valid content. 401 indicates an authentication failure, and you've probably seen the 404 response code many times when you're trying to go to a web page that doesn't exist. And even in this context, 404 means that we try to access a non-existent resource. And finally, if we receive a 500 response code, the issue that we're experiencing is because of something going on the server. It's having issues. It's not the fault of our request. And the payload, that's going to provide details behind the response. If the request was successful, the payload might include things like device inventory, interface data, or configuration values. Or if there was an error, the payload might explain why that happened. For example, which field was invalid or which resource couldn't be found. And Cisco Catalyst Center, it uses REST APIs extensively. When we query inventory, we push configuration, or we retrieve assurance data, the response code tells us whether or not the operation succeeded, while the payload returns the actual network data. And the ability to interpret both is important for us to know how to do when automating or troubleshooting API-driven networks. And finally, I'd like you to understand that REST-Conf uses the same REST principles that we've been talking about. For example, it uses standard HTTP response codes, and the payload contains structured data based on Yang data models. And from an exam perspective, the key point is that interpreting REST-Conf responses works the same way. Check the response code first, then examine the payload to better understand the result.